So, I thought this is a very interesting subject in the light of things that are happening in the world right now. I've done lots and lots of talks over the last numbers of years, and the word peace hasn't made it into any of the titles, but it's made it into this one because I think we're heading fast towards this time of false peace, and it is a prelude to final judgment. You could change that to say prelude to Armageddon. Now, we've just read those verses from 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 2, and I'll just read them again. And we know these words very, very well, and I think they're extremely relevant for what is going to come soon. So in verse 2, it says, "For you know very well that the day of the Lord," that clearly is talking about the time when Jesus is going to return, "it's going to come, the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night." In other words, it's going to take the world by surprise. I've done a talk about this phrase, Jesus coming as a thief. It isn't the fact that he's coming quietly, it's the unexpectedness of his return that's going to completely shock the world. It doesn't shock us, though, by the way, because it says, for us who are awake, he doesn't come to us as a thief because, well, we're expecting him. Why are we expecting him? Because we're watching and looking for him. And quite clearly, we're taking into account the verses like we've got next coming up in verse 3, which are giving us part of the signs of the return of Jesus. Because it then says that while people are saying peace and safety, destruction will come upon them suddenly as labor pains on a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. So we've got this period of peace and safety, and it says while people are saying this, so it's not saying there's a specific group. It just sounds like generally people are saying, "Oh, we've got peace and safety," and lo and behold, it isn't true peace and safety. It's a false peace and safety, quite clearly, because it leads to destruction, and the destruction seems to come out of nowhere. It's absolutely sudden, and it's clearly linking the day of the Lord happening at about this time, because it's linking, isn't it? Verse 1 saying the day of the Lord, Jesus' return is going to come like a thief in the night. While people are saying peace and safety, destruction comes on them. So at some point, I think, in amongst this peace and safety situation, and probably maybe before the destruction comes, Jesus has come as a thief in the night. Because if the destruction is underway, perhaps we might be expecting him to come, but I wonder if he comes perhaps during this peace and safety time that comes on the earth. Now, quite clearly, it doesn't need 2 minutes looking at BBC News or, in fact, any news channel, and there isn't a great deal of talk about peace and safety. There's a great deal of talk about conflict, death, destruction, and war. So, what on earth is this peace and safety, and how is that going to arrive? And that is what we're going to look at if you're up for that. I called this talk False Peace Prelude to Final Judgment. I mean, it sort of makes sense it's a false peace because if it was a true peace, it wouldn't lead to great destruction. It's false, as I've put there, because it's a peace that is built on man's thinking, man's ideals. It's not a godly, righteous peace, I don't think at all. It's a false peace because it's temporary, that's quite clear, and it is going to lead to Armageddon, as we're going to see. It's false because it's a peace founded on overconfidence in man's own strength. It's nothing to do with a peace that is relying on God and his ways. It's a false peace, and this might surprise you, but I want to show you this. Uh, it's a false peace because I think it's going to be a peace that's built on the division of God's land of Israel. And I want to try and piece some verses together to say that I actually wonder if this is one of the catalysts to the destruction coming. And the last one there, you probably this doesn't mean a great deal to you unless you've perhaps read the Weekly World Watch over the years or watched any of the videos I've posted on YouTube. But I'm basically saying that the false peace comes between the inner ring war and the outer circle war, which are two wars. They're two separate conflicts that come that impact Israel. One is an inner ring that surrounds Israel and her immediate neighbors, and then there's a wider outer circle war, which are countries that are much further afield that come and attack Israel. And I believe that the false peace comes between those two events. So, just to put all of this into some perspective, then, I've just mentioned this inner ring war, and this is a slide that I've had for years and years now, and I called it the inner ring war prelude to Christ's return. And around about 15 years ago, I started posting things in the World Watch and putting out videos saying that I actually think there's going to be an inner ring war which will involve Israel fighting her immediate neighbors, and Israel is going to overcome these pricking briars, as Ezekiel calls them, and is actually going to win this inner ring war, which is then in turn going to lead to this temporary time of peace. And there's a number of places. I'm not going to do a full study, don't worry, on the inner ring war because there's quite a lot of content on that already up on the internet. But it's taken from Psalm 83, and I'm just quickly opening my Bible. I don't know if you've got your Bibles there, but it's not going to come up on the screen, this particular bit. So I'm going to just open up Psalm 83. It's written by a prophet. His name was Asaph. And I think there's a lot of evidence to say that Psalm 83 is a prophecy that had got prior fulfillment, but absolutely has got a latter day fulfillment. Israel's enemies rise up, it says in verse 2, they make a tumult. Verse 3 says that they've taken crafty counsel against the people of Israel. And in verse 4, it says they've said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. And so basically, there's this group of people that are listed out from verses 6 to 8 that consult together and say, right, we're just going to finish off Israel and that's the end. The psalm finishes in verse 18 saying that all these things happen so that men know that you, O God, whose name is Jehovah or Yahweh, art the most high over all the earth. And the conclusion of this war, therefore, is ultimately that men know that God is actually in control. And all those places that you can see on the screen there, Gebel and Tyre and Philistia and Ammon, they're all there in Psalm 83 from verse 6 to verse 8. And as you can see, they form a very tight inner ring around Israel. Hence, I called it the inner ring war some time ago. Now, what actually it goes on and says in Psalm 83, and it's, I guess, an imprecatory psalm, which basically means the psalmist himself is calling on God to judge Israel's enemies. And in verse 9, it says, do to them as you did to the Midianites, and as you did to Sisera and Jabin. They were destroyed at Endor, and their decaying corpses fertilized the soil. Let their mighty nobles die as Oreb and Zeb, and let their princes die like Zebah and Zalmunna. And you look at the names of these people, and I'm thinking to myself, well, actually, it seems to me that these inner ring, these nations, these tribes that surround Israel, that want to finish Israel off, are going to come to an end, like the people that we've highlighted there on the screen. So what I then did was thought, well, who's Sisera and Jabin and Oreb and Zeb and Zebah and Zalmunna? And what you find out is it doesn't take you very long with a concordance, that they're all military leaders. They're all enemies of Israel. They were all killed at the time of Gideon, and every last one of them is mentioned in the book of Judges, verse chapters 6 to 9, and nowhere else. So it's this very limited period of time that the psalmist is referring to, and that all of them are commanders or princes, they're leaders, enemies of Israel. Every last one of them killed. Um, and it's all happening at the time of Gideon, and Gideon is heavily involved in all of these situations of these military leaders being killed. Now, have a watch of this video.
On Sunday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced the new military campaign.
As we promised, we have launched a powerful campaign against Hamas, Gideon's chariots. IDF forces are simply entering with force into the Gaza Strip with the dual goal, defeating Hamas and freeing our hostages.
While the air and ground operation begins, Israel announced it's also pursuing every opportunity to reach an agreement to release all of the hostages. One deal under consideration by U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff would include a temporary ceasefire, release of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners, then followed by more negotiations to end the war.
So I don't know if you heard that very clearly. Hopefully the sound's coming through. But Benjamin Netanyahu has called this campaign Gideon's Chariots. And isn't it, do you think this is a huge coincidence? I mean, I don't know if he's, deliberately linking back to events of Psalm 83. He does believe in God. He believes in the Bible. He quotes it a lot. I don't know. But what I've just quoted to you from Psalm 83 is that all those leaders were there at the time of Gideon, who was involved in ancient times. And here we are with this campaign against Hamas called Gideon's Chariots. Of course, perhaps the most famous of those military leaders that was killed was the military general Sisera. And he's famous because of the way he was killed. He was killed by Jael, that lady on the screen there, and she got a tent peg and smashed it with a hammer through his temples into the ground. This is a pretty shocking way to die. He's sort of lying in bed and comes to a cataclysmic end. But isn't it amazing when you see events like this coming up?
How the Hamas leader was killed. On July 1st, 2024, Tehran was rocked by a shocking event. Hamas leader Haniyeh and his bodyguard were assassinated at the heavily guarded Basij al-Zahra guest house, protected by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. The guest house is located near Sadabad Palace and the official residence of the President of Iran. Earlier that day, Haniyeh had arrived in Iran to attend the president's inauguration and meet with the supreme leader. According to the Telegraph UK, a bomb was reportedly planted in his room 2 months prior and triggered remotely by Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency.
So there was the Hamas leader. Where was he? He's lying in bed, and the next minute he is destroyed. Where was Sisera? He's lying in bed, and the next minute he is destroyed. And in fact, a number of senior military commanders of Hamas and Hezbollah were killed in operations quite similar, but not as dramatic, perhaps, because this was in the middle of the capital city of Israel's arch enemy. And of course, what we've seen over the last number of months and a year or so ago, we've seen one by one the entire military terrorist leadership taken out by Israel. All of the senior Hamas leaders, one by one, have been eliminated. And the same applies to the other terrorist group that's part of this inner ring war of Hezbollah, which are north of Israel. And all of them, from Hassan Nasrallah all the way down, the entirety of the Hezbollah chain of command was destroyed by Israel. And remember those pages that all exploded, causing absolute chaos for that particular terrorist group. And the same has been happening in Iran, where Israel has removed The Armed Forces Chief of Staff, he was assassinated. The Commander-in-Chief was assassinated. The Deputy Armed Forces Chief has been assassinated. All of them killed. And all, I would say, in fulfillment of Psalm 83. So we see Psalm 83 in the Inner Ring War has been happening. And I'm not saying it's over at this point. There could well be more. I don't know when we move to the next phase, which is peace and some peace agreements. But I think the peace agreements are coming, but there could be more conflict in the short term. In Zechariah chapter 12, it talks about exactly the same event. It says in verse 6 that in that day, in this day that we're thinking about, I will make the leaders of Judah, like Prime Minister Netanyahu, like a fire pot in a wood pile and like a flaming torch among the sheaves of grain. Now look what the leaders of Judah do, the leaders of Israel. They will devour all the surrounding peoples on the right hand and on the left, and the people of Jerusalem will again live securely in their own place in Jerusalem. So basically, we're being told that in this inner ring war, Israel will devour the surrounding peoples, and that's exactly what we have been seeing. We have been watching with our very own eyes Zechariah 12 happening and Psalm 83 happening. But the people in Jerusalem have lived securely so far, but I think this is also a reference to more security that they think they've got that comes down the track. But of course, the conclusion so far to what we've seen was the American attack directly on Iran, which sort of brought things to a sort of a conclusion at that point in time. Have a look at this.
We're following breaking news out of the Middle East. President Trump announced that the U.S. has attacked 3 nuclear sites in Iran. In a post on Truth Social, he called the attack successful and says the planes are now outside of Iranian airspace. Mr. Trump went on to write, quote, "Now is the time for peace."
Now is the time for peace, all capital letters, right? So Donald Trump is saying we've got to get peace now. That's it. We've dropped these enormous bombs on Iran. Now's the time to bring peace about. And there's one of his, that was on the left-hand side, what he posted. Congratulations, world. It's time for peace. Now, you may actually think Donald Trump is maybe a man of war. I don't know what you think, but actually he talks a lot about wanting peace. And one of the major drivers of Donald Trump is on the right-hand side there. If you asked him, if we got him on the phone right now and said, give us your top 3 objectives for the next few years, I guarantee you he would have the words peace in it, and he would have the Nobel Peace Prize, because he wants that more than anything. It's something money can't buy. He's got to be granted this, and the only way he's going to get the Nobel Peace Prize, which of course Obama got, and he covets what Obama had, is that he's got to try and make peace. It's an absolutely huge driver for him. Have a look at this.
All right, for the U.S. president, Nobel Peace Prize is a living dream. He keeps talking about how he should get it and how he deserves it more than anybody else in the world. And now, Donald Trump's Nobel dream has got a new powerful backer. The visiting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He said the following words, much to the pleasure of the American president. Take a listen.
To you, Mr. President, the letter I sent to the Nobel Prize Committee. It's nominating you for the Peace Prize, which is well deserved, and you should get it.
Thank you very much. This I didn't know. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Coming from you in particular, this is very meaningful. Thank you very much, baby.
So there they are. This was about a week ago, or maybe 2 weeks ago now. And Benjamin Netanyahu is there with President Trump at the White House and says, here's a letter. I've written it to request that you're put forward to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And this is what Trump wants. That isn't a guarantee he gets it. You have to be nominated and then you go through a process. So isn't this interesting?
All right, for the
So what we then find is now this is in Israel's most popular publication, news publication called Israel. I don't even know how you say it, Hayom, and I think it means Israel Today. It's the most read news article or news publication in Israel. And I found this, so this is going back, you probably see the date down below, the 26th of June 2025. And it had got Trump and Netanyahu's two-state vision, Gaza war's end, Abraham Accords expansion. And it basically says there, look, they reached consensus. So Trump and Netanyahu, it says, have reached consensus on fundamental principles to end Gaza hostilities, to expand the Abraham Accords, and to create a two-state solution with limited Israel sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. And the article went on, and I've just taken out the what the article said. There was the next headline was consensus for future peace. So what it said was, and this was the consensus that Trump and Netanyahu have agreed together. Number one, that the Gaza conflict comes to an end. Egypt and the United Arab Emirates and others take over the Gaza area and they replace Hamas and they free the hostages. Number two, some Gaza residents will emigrate to other countries. Number three, the Abraham Accords, which of course Trump invented in his first term, will be expanded to include Syria, Saudi Arabia, and others who will all recognize Israel. Number four, Israel will support a two-state solution conditional on Palestinian Authority reforms. And number five, America acknowledges limited Israeli sovereignty in parts of Judea and Samaria. So this is what was reported and sourced in several places. And it seemed to me to be very interesting because perhaps this is the blueprint that has been cooked up between Trump and Netanyahu to get really Trump's dream over the line, probably more than Netanyahu's dream over the line. It's Trump who's driving this. He wants peace more than anything else, and he will do just about anything it takes, as we're going to see, to get there. Now, you notice I've put in blue there some passages that line up against each of these stages, because actually, of course, Gaza conflict ending and replacing Hamas links directly to Psalm 83, Amos chapter 1, and in fact is an allegory of Genesis chapter 14. And we're not going to have a look at any of that this evening. The fact that some Gaza residents are going to be apparently exported to other countries is extremely interesting. Let's just have a quick look at that one. In Joel chapter 3, is a prophecy. Joel is only 3 chapters long, I'm sure you're aware. And the 3rd chapter is all about Armageddon and the lead up to Armageddon. And in verse 4 of Joel 3, it says, this is God talking, by the way, what have you got to do with me, O Tyre and Zidon, and all the coasts of Palestine? Will you render me a recompense? And if you recompense me, swiftly and speedily will I return your recompense upon your own head. And Tyre and Zidon are the bases of Hezbollah, who we've already looked at as a terrorist organization wanting to destroy Israel. And the coast of Palestine is a reference to what we would now call the Gaza Strip, which is the home of Hamas. So what you've got in Joel 3 is Hezbollah and Hamas. And God says, are you repaying me for something I've done? Because if you're paying me back, I'm going to swiftly and speedily return on your own heads what you have done. Well, we know what they've done. They've tried to destroy Israel, and God has turned it on their own heads. But in verse 8 of Joel chapter 3, talking about these people, God says, I will sell your sons and your daughters into the hand of the children of Judah. Direct reference there, of course, to Zechariah 12. And they, in turn, are going to sell these people to the Sabaeans. So where it talks about the sons and daughters being sold into the hand of the children of Judah, God's saying, the people of Tyre and Zidon and the people of the Gaza Strip are going to be sold by Israel to the Sabaeans, to a people afar off. In other words, the people living in amongst Israel and in the Gaza Strip and so on are going to be exported. They're going to be sold, and they're going to be sold to the Sabaeans. So I go and look at where the Sabaeans are, and it says that they are in a kingdom. It says there, look in Wikipedia, the kingdom of Saba, which is in modern day Yemen. So I went and looked all of this up. And in fact, on the left there, there's the kingdom of Sabia in orange. And on the right hand side is a modern map. And as you can see, Wikipedia is right. It's sort of Yemen and also southern Saudi Arabia. So basically, the very plan that has been put in front of us in that Israeli newspaper about exporting the Gazan people elsewhere is exactly what the Bible says is going to happen. Now have a look at this.
Palestinian groups and tonight the Arab League have accused President Trump of advocating ethnic cleansing after he proposed relocating most of Gaza's residents to neighbouring Arab countries. It comes as Israel is continuing to prevent thousands of Palestinians from returning home to northern Gaza because Israel says Hamas has violated the ceasefire agreement by not providing information about the remaining hostages. Well, the US president earlier described Gaza as literally a demolition site and said neighbouring Jordan and Egypt should take people in from the territory, saying that would clean it out.
So these things are being said exactly like the Bible has said would happen. I mean, I find this so amazing that God has told us so much detail about events happening right in front of us. It should boost our faith that God is in control of all these things that we're seeing happening. Now, of course, the Inner Ring War, as I say, comes to an end, and there is this time of peace that we're going to look at. And what I've put on there is you've got the Inner Ring War that leads to false peace, which in turn leads to the Outer Circle War. So just to show you how this looks on the map, there in that circle, sort of down the bottom here, is a sort of we've come outwards basically, haven't we? So you can see there's Israel, and there's all these tribes in Psalm 83, all of them in trouble with all the leaders being taken out. And then you've got all these other outer circle of nations that swoop in sometime afterwards. Now, these nations, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Togarmah, Persia, Cush, Put, all of those that you can see in this outer circle are all, they're not mentioned in, of course, in Psalm 83, they're mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 38. And this is what we've probably spent a lot of time as a community looking at, and rightly so, because this is Armageddon. This is the outer circle war that invade Israel. And instead of Israel winning at this point, Israel in fact loses, and loses dramatically, because Zechariah 14 tells you that basically Jerusalem is ransacked and the women are ravished and people in Israel themselves are taken into captivity. So the tables are turned on Israel when this huge outer circle of nations headed up by Russia come in, because the nations involved, if you convert those names into modern day language, Magog, Meshech, Tubal is all to do with Russia. Togarmah and that area there, and Gomer is to do with Turkey. Persia is modern day Iran, and that's why Iran has survived and won't be destroyed before this happens. And Put and Cush are both to do with northern Africa, especially Libya and the Kingdom of Sudan. And there's almost this huge pincer movement against Israel, as you can see. But here's the thing. So here's another map showing you the same thing. It's the same countries that we've just been talking about. And this is the outer circle nations that come in. And there's little Israel, look in the middle there in red. And what we're saying is this inner ring war, and then there's great destruction that Israel brings on those nearby people, and the fire eventually is put out, and Israel lives in this temporary false peace for a short period of time. I don't think it's very long. And then Russia and all these nations come in. Now, we're supposed to be talking about this time of peace, but have a look at this, because it says in Ezekiel 38, verses 8 and 9, and this is in the New Living Translation, it says, a long time from now, you, talking to the Russian leader, actually, Gog, but he's symbolic of all these nations that are coming in, this outer circle group of nations. God says, a long time from now, so probably in the days in which we live, you're going to be called into action. In the distant future, you will swoop down on the land of Israel. Now look at this, which will be enjoying peace after recovering from war. Well, 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 we're being told that when the Great Gogian invasion, as we call it, happens, when Russia, headed up by Gog, the Russian leader, comes and attacks Israel, they're recovering from war and they're enjoying peace. The very thing that we started off by saying in 1 Thessalonians 5, there's going to be a time of peace and then sudden destruction. And notice when it happens, it's after its people, i.e. the Jews, have returned from many lands to the mountains of Israel. So it's basically God saying, look, it's when you see the Jews have come back from many lands back into the land. Well, that happened in 1948. Until 1948, there was no nation of Israel. From AD 70, for nearly 2,000 years, there was no nation of Israel. The people returned, they're living in the land. Clearly, then there has been war, but there's this time now that they're enjoying peace and they're recovering, they're drawing breath from this war that has taken place. And then all these nations come in, as we've said. This is the outer circle war. Now, there's a number of places in Ezekiel 38, bearing in mind it's Ezekiel 38 that tells us about Armageddon. It's the chapter that tells us about those nations that we've just been talking about. And look what it says in verse 8. After many days, you, Gog, Russian leader, you're going to be called to arms. In future years, you will invade a land that's recovered from war, whose people have been gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate, and they've been brought forth out of the nations, and now all of them live in safety. That's the same verse that we've just looked at, but a different version. But you can see there's this idea that they're living in safety. Then you come to verse 11, look. You will say, this again talking to the Russian leader Gog, you will say, I will invade a land of unwalled villages. I will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls and without gates and bars, and I will plunder and loot and take all their stuff, basically. So here we are again. God's reinforcing this message that they're living peacefully and they're not suspecting what's about to happen. They think they're victorious, but actually they're not. 2 verses later, verse 14, repeated again. So 3 times clearly in the same few verses, God is saying the same message. Therefore, Son of Man, prophesy and say to Gog, this is what the sovereign Lord says. In that day, when my people are living in safety, will you not take notice of it? You will come from your place in the far north. You don't get any further north than Russia, by the way, north of Israel. You and many nations with you, like the ones are listed, Turkey, Iran, and so on. You will advance against my people Israel like a cloud that covers the land. When does Gog do it? He does it when the people of Israel are living in safety. Now, I'm going to play you another video coming up. This is President Trump once again, and this time he's talking again about peace. This was not that long ago, and he's in Saudi Arabia, of all places, and have a listen to what he says.
Possibilities on the world stage. After so many decades of conflict, finally it is within our grasp to reach the future that generations before us could only dream about, a land of peace, safety, harmony, opportunity, innovation, and achievement right here in the Middle East. So beautiful. It's such a beautiful thing that's happening. I guess, the people that are here can't even really appreciate it because you see it happening, and it's when you come to a place that you haven't seen in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years that it's even more incredible. When I left office just over 4 years ago, that future seemed almost impossible, what you've done. Together we had obliterated the killers of ISIS. We wiped them out, terminated its founder and leader, al-Baghdadi. We had healed the divide in the Gulf Cooperation Council, it's a very big deal, and united the nations of the region to stand against the enemies of all civilization. We'd imposed unprecedented sanctions on Iran and starved the regime of resources to fund terror. They were unable to fund anything because they had no money left. They had no money. But the new administration came in and let them have a lot of money, and you saw what happened. It was not money well spent. And with the historic Abraham Accords that we're so proud of, all the momentum was aimed at peace, and it aimed very successfully. It's been an amazing thing, the Abraham Accords, and it's my fervent hope, wish, and even my dream that Saudi Arabia, a place I have such respect for, especially over the last fairly short period of time, what you've been able to do, but we'll soon be joining the Abraham Accords. I think it'll be a tremendous tribute to your country, and it will be something that's...
So President Trump wants Saudi Arabia to be part of this peace, part of the Abraham Accords, and to create this new peaceful, prosperous Middle East. Now, why that is interesting is because in the very same chapter of Ezekiel 38, there is an opposing force to Russia coming down into Israel. And in verse 13, it tells you who this opposing force is. And it starts off by saying, Sheba and Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions thereof, will say to you, Gog, Russian leader, have you come to take a spoil? Have you gathered your company to take a prey and to take away silver and gold and so on? And those two nations on the first of the list there is Sheba and Dedan. So you go and look on a map and say to yourself, well, where is Sheba and Dedan? And lo and behold, it's Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Arab states, the very same ones that President Trump is trying to bring into the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords, by the way, brought in some smaller Gulf Arab nations into an agreement. And this agreement is basically saying they recognize Israel's right to exist. And now he wants Saudi Arabia to join that. And if you look, going back to this consensus for future peace, number one was ending the conflict in Gaza, and bringing that to an end and replacing Hamas and freeing the hostages. Number two was getting Gazan residents to emigrate to other countries, Joel 3. Number three on the list was Abraham Accords expanded to include Syria and Saudi Arabia and others as well, to create this sense of security and sense of safety and sense of peace. Syria is a question mark for me, whether I don't think Trump will get Syria in, because Syria is going to be utterly destroyed. That's another subject. But isn't that sort of quite interesting? But here's the multi-million-dollar question that I hadn't really asked myself until perhaps fairly recently. And it's this. Why is it, if there is this temporary peace, why on earth is it God himself who brings Russia against Israel? Why doesn't he just let the world live in peace? because look what it says in Ezekiel 38, verse 4. It says, this is what the sovereign Lord says: I am against you, Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, the Russian leader. I will turn you around and put hooks in your jaws and bring you out with your whole army. It's God's hand in design. It's God's hand, as you can see, this generated image of these hooks in jaws, and there's God's hand pulling Russia against Israel. And it made me think to myself, why? Because every single solitary other time that God has ever brought a nation against Israel, it's because Israel's done something that God doesn't like. But there's no reference to that in Ezekiel 38 because it says what the motivation of Russia is, and that's to take a spoil. But it doesn't say what God's motivation is necessarily to bring all of these things about. Apart from, it does say in verse 16 that God says, I will bring you against my land so that the nations may know me and I may show myself holy through you before their eyes, O Gog. So Gog is a tool of judgment. But I think there's a little clue here in Ezekiel 38 that there's a problem going on with God's land. From God's perspective, there's a problem with the land. Now, let me just show you what I think that is. Because snuck away here in item number 4 on this consensus for future peace that might seem unbelievably ridiculous as we sit here now with Israel fighting the war that it's currently still fighting. Number 4, bearing in mind this was a Trump and Netanyahu consensus for future peace, number 4 is that Israel supports a two-state solution conditional on Palestinian Authority reforms. Now, that is quite amazing that that's got published in that way. Could it be that if number 1, number 2, and number 3 are put in place somehow, and Trump drives that forward, that there is enormous pressure then upon Israel to divide the land and allow part of the land itself to be given to the Palestinian Authority? And bearing in mind, it is God's land and it isn't a land to be negotiated away. But what if Trump himself forces that negotiation and pushes Israel? We know the power that Trump has actually got over Israel and other nations. That could potentially happen now. But what does it say in the Bible about this? Well, here's some clues. In Joel chapter 3, the verse that we talked about, the chapter that we talked about leading up to Armageddon, God says that he's going to gather the armies of the world into the valley of Jehoshaphat, that's in Jerusalem, and he's going to judge them there for harming my people, my special possession, for scattering my people among the nations, and look what the final one is, for dividing my land. The indictment of God is Armageddon happens because you've divided up my land. Now, well, have a look at this, because the dividing of Israel's land is actually and has been quite a major objective of America for some time.
America's answer to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been pretty consistent over the years.
A viable two-state solution is the only way this conflict can end.
I like two-state solution. We cannot give up on a two-state solution.
So what exactly is the two-state solution? It's a Palestinian state and an Israeli state coexisting side by side.
The two-state solution is the dream and almost the fantasy of those who actually want peace between Israel and the Palestinians.
The reasons that fantasy has been so elusive, the two sides have never agreed on exact boundaries, control over the holy city of Jerusalem, or the exact rules governing a peaceful coexistence.
So, and as you know as well as I do, this is not just America that actually want a two-state solution ultimately. It's the driving force of almost all nations on earth. Just about every single one say Israel should be divided. There should be two states, a Palestinian state and an Israeli state. And I think this is absolutely on the cards at some point. Now, there's one other thing I want to show you. And I only found this out the other day, and so I'm quite excited to show you this to see what you think. So in Ezekiel chapter 38, this chapter we've been looking at, that's been talking all the way through about there's this time of peace and security and safety, and it's a full sense of security. It says in verse 18, look, it will come to pass at the same time, when Gog, Russian leader, comes against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, that my fury shall come up in my face. For in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken. Surely in that day there will be a great shaking in the land of Israel, so that the fish of the sea and the fowls of the heaven and the beasts of the field and the creeping things that creep upon the earth and all the men that are upon the face of the earth will shake up my presence, and the mountains will be thrown down, and the steep places will fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground. And I will plead with him with pestilence and with blood, and I'll rain upon him and upon his bands, that means the great company and army, and upon the many people that are with him, an overflowing rain and great hailstones, fire and brimstone. So we've got this time of fury, of walls falling, and these great hailstones. Now, what I like to do is to say to myself, right, there's a passage, and it's almost like a hidden code in the Bible in a way, because what God tends to do, we talk about golden threads that run through the Bible. So, God will mention, I don't know, something in Genesis 3 about man working by the sweat of his face. And the only other time the word sweat crops up is when Jesus is sweating great drops of blood in the Garden of Gethsemane. The only two times sweat is used, but you link the two words together and you see that the curse that happened in the garden is exactly the thing that's being played out when Jesus is about to be sacrificed. So there's all of these things happen all the time in the scriptures. So I tend to look at verses like this and then say, are these themes happening anywhere else? And what I found was in Ezekiel chapter 13, there's this super interesting passage, because it says in Ezekiel 13 verse 10, they, talking about the false prophets in Israel, so false leaders, have seduced my people, saying peace. And there was no peace. And one of them built up a wall, and they daubed it with untempered mortar. And God says, say unto them which daub it with untempered mortar, that it's going to fall. And there's going to be an overflowing shower, and ye, O great hailstones, shall fall, and a stormy wind will rend it. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, I will rend it. In other words, I'll break it down with a stormy wind in my fury, and there'll be an overflowing shower in mine anger, and great hailstones in my fury to consume it. Now, here's the thing. You see this word hailstones that occurs twice in this verse 10. And remember, you've got the verse hailstones here in Ezekiel 38 when Gog comes to an end. The only three places that this Hebrew word is used in the Bible is here in Ezekiel 38 verse 22 and here in Ezekiel 13 verse 10. And it's the only time that this Hebrew word for hailstones is used. In fact, it's the only time hailstones is used in the Old Testament anywhere. So this now says to me that these two events are they've got to be linked, because why would it only be these two occasions? And not only are we linked with hailstones, we're linked with the phrase my fury. You notice there at the end it says, in my fury this is going to happen. We go back to Ezekiel 38, God says, in my fury this is going to happen. We also read in Ezekiel 13 verse 10, there's a wall that's been built up. And what we go back, sorry, I'm flicking backwards and forwards, Ezekiel 38 says every wall is going to fall. But here in Ezekiel 13, it's telling us that the false prophets in Israel have seduced the people, saying there's going to be peace, and one has built up a wall, and God says, I hate this wall. I'm going to rend down this wall. And I think, brothers and sisters, that the wall is the division. It is the dividing of the land. And the false prophets, that whoever's in power at that time in Israel, because it might not be Netanyahu, somebody in Israel has agreed to the seducing words of Trump or whoever it is that's making them do this. If you divide the land, you will have peace. And this is breaking a covenant that God made with the people. There was a covenant, and the covenant was with the land. They can't divide the land, and there will be no peace if you do this. And I believe this is the very reason why God puts hooks in the jaws and brings Russia down into Israel. They have divided his land. They thought there was peace, and there is no peace. They should not have done this. It's an indictment upon the people at that time. Which brings us back to 1 Thessalonians 5. We've nearly finished, you'll be glad to know. In verse 2, you know very well, says Paul to the Thessalonians, that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night, and it's while people are saying peace and safety. And I believe that the Lord Jesus Christ himself will appear in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory during this time of when people are saying peace and safety. And that time could be fast upon us. So here's the order. The inner ring war, I absolutely believe we've been witnessing, and it may not be over. There could be more yet to the inner ring war and more destruction. I'm not saying the inner ring war's over, but what I am saying is I totally do believe we are seeing it playing out in front of us right now, with all those leaders being killed like Sisera and so on. And at some point, we're going to see Israel completely defeat its nearby enemies, and they're going to be forced into peace negotiations and so on. And I think at about this time, there is going to be a peace treaty that is made and possibly forced upon Israel. Possibly they just agree to it because they've got no other way to do it. But somehow or other, there is some peace agreement that is made, and everybody thinks this is over. But I think that peace is to do with the division of the land. By the way, I think it's at that time that people should flee Israel. It's another story. We're not going to do it tonight. But the events of AD 70, I truly believe, are actually replicated at the time of the end. Do you remember at the time of the end, in AD 70, Jesus said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then flee to Israel, flee out of the land. And you think, well, how on earth can that happen? How could you flee if Jerusalem's surrounded by armies? But there was a gap. There was a time when the armies withdrew, allowing people, if they listened to Jesus, to withdraw and flee themselves before the final destruction of AD 70 came. I actually think events are happening very similar, in a similar vein, and that there will be this time, this pause, if you like, in the conflict. That will be the time to escape, because there will be this outer circle war that comes hot on its heels. Somewhere in amongst all of this, Jesus himself appears in the clouds of heaven and returns. So that's why I thought we'd have a look this evening at False Peace, the prelude to final judgment, and maybe with the push of President Trump to win his Nobel Peace Prize, which is #1 on his agenda, it could be the very thing that brings about the false peace that the Bible has long predicted. Thank you for listening.